She served without speaking, cleaned without resting, and watched them eat while her stomach stayed hollow. But when a rancher with no children of his own asked, "Why isn't she eating too?" everything changed. The plate was still warm when he noticed. A roast hen, potatoes thick with gravy, 2 slices of cornbread cut evenly across the table. But there were only 4 plates and 5 people. The girl, the youngest, sat by the stove with her hands folded in her lap, her dress too short at the ankles, her hair tied back in a rough knot. She didn't touch a thing, didn't raise her head, just sat still like someone used to being ignored or punished for speaking. John Fletcher didn't say anything at first. He watched, took in the room, plain walls, cracked windows, and the kind of quiet that came from people who had learned how to hide cruelty behind good manners. The father, Harold Trask, chewed loudly, talking about rainfall and corn blight. The mother, Esther, passed the butter down to their 2 sons, both healthy, loud, and flushed with appetite. But the girl didn't move. She couldn't have been more than 8. And she was starving. Not just for food. That part was clear. Her shoulders sloped forward in a way that spoke of carrying burdens not meant for children. Her arms were skinny, knuckles red from scrubbing. But there was another kind of hunger in her, quiet, hollow-eyed, the kind that came from not being seen, not being loved. John set his fork down, slowly. "Why isn't she eating too?" he asked, his voice low and even. The table went still. Harold blinked. Esther's hand paused mid-reach for the salt. "Oh, she already ate," Esther said quickly, too quickly. "Had her plate before we all sat down." The girl didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't even blink. John leaned back in his chair, arms crossing loosely over his chest. His gaze didn't move from the girl. "That true, sweetheart?" he asked her directly. Still nothing, but her eyes lifted just once and met his. It was enough. Harold cleared his throat. "She's quiet, that one. Best to let her be. Likes to help out around the house, don't you, June?" June, that was her name. The girl gave a small nod, but it was forced, like she knew exactly how to answer without bringing consequence. John felt something cold settle deep in his chest. He'd seen it before too many times. Children turned into shadows in their own homes, daughters raised as servants, wives to be trained before they could read. He thought of his own wife, long past now, and of the 3 stillbirths they'd buried in silence, graves too small for names. He didn't touch the rest of his meal. After dinner, June cleared the table without being asked. She moved fast, like someone who knew hesitation brought yelling. The boys disappeared out back, and Esther followed to tend to the wash. John stayed in the kitchen, leaned against the counter while June scrubbed plates that hadn't belonged to her. "You really eat earlier?" he asked again, softer this time. June didn't look up. "Yes, sir." It was a lie, he could hear it in her voice, but it wasn't defiance, it was protection, a lie learned to keep peace. "You got chores tomorrow?" "Yes, sir." "What kind?" "Feed the hens, chop kindling, sweep, then school." "You like school?" A pause. Another lie. "Yes, sir." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped forward, took a clean plate from the drying rack, and dried it with the towel folded at his side. June blinked up at him, startled. "No girl should be this quiet," he murmured. "Not unless she's afraid." She said nothing. He watched her a moment longer, then set the plate down and walked outside into the cooling night. That evening he slept in the barn on account of guest quarters being full, though there was an empty room in the house. He didn't mind. The stars were out and the air smelled of dry wheat and smoke, but sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, a sound stirred him. Whimpering, soft, like a mouse behind a wall. He sat up and listened. It came again through the cracks in the barn wall, from the house. John pulled on his coat and stepped toward the porch. The door was ajar, and there, just inside the kitchen, crouched June, alone, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her eyes wet and open, staring at nothing. He didn't speak, just stood there waiting. After a long minute, she noticed him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" I dropped the mug, one of Mama's good ones." Her lip trembled. John stepped inside and saw the broken porcelain near her feet, swept into a neat pile. He crouched down slowly beside her. "Did anyone see?" She shook her head. "You get hurt." She shook her head again. He nodded, then no harm done. Her eyes lifted to his, uncertain. "You ever been to a ranch, June?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "No, sir." "You like horses?" A hesitant pause. "Yes." "I've got 5. One of 'em's about to foal. Could use a girl who's good at quiet." She didn't answer, but her fingers twitched slightly. John smiled again, still soft, still sad. "I'm leaving in the morning," he said. "If I had my say, I'd take someone with me. Someone who looks after others more than herself. Someone who deserves more than scraps." June looked up at him wide-eyed, but then she looked down again. I can't." "Why not?" She didn't answer, didn't have to. He saw the answer in her silence. Fear, obligation, maybe something worse. But he didn't push. He simply stood, walked to the stove and ladled stew into a fresh bowl, set it down in front of her with a spoon, then turned and walked back to the barn without another word. By morning she was gone from the kitchen. No sign of the bowl, just a clean spot where it had been. At breakfast, Harold joked about coyotes and long winters. Esther asked if John had slept all right. The boys argued over who got the end piece of the bread. And June poured coffee in silence. But John saw the faintest trace of broth on her cuff. As he saddled his horse later that morning, June stood on the porch, eyes fixed on him. She didn't wave, didn't speak, but when he turned to go, she took one small step forward. Just one. And it was enough. The sun rose slow that morning, brushing the frostbitten hills with light that looked warmer than it felt. John Fletcher rode east, back toward the canyon lands that guarded his ranch like solemn, crooked fingers. Dust followed his horse in low, lazy clouds. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind stayed behind. June. He hadn't said goodbye, not properly, but maybe it was better that way. Sometimes words made things harder, especially when it was a goodbye that shouldn't have to happen. He'd seen it before, in towns where men drank too much and wives flinched too easy, where children stood in corners too long and learned to vanish in plain sight. June wasn't just unloved, she was forgotten, erased, reduced to service and silence. A cup-bearer at a table where she should have been seated like any other child. And it wasn't just him who'd noticed. The dog had stayed close to her that night, an old mutt who usually kept to himself. Even animals could tell when someone was hurting. Still, he left. What else could he do? She wasn't his, not yet. He rode on for hours, but every empty field seemed to echo with her voice, or what it could be if she ever raised it above a whisper. He thought of the way she'd looked at him, not with hope, but with suspicion. Like kindness was something she'd learned not to trust. That stayed with him longer than he wanted. The ranch came into view just past noon. A modest stretch of land tucked between canyons and cottonwoods, fence posts leaning with time but still strong. The horses greeted him from the corral, snorting through the rails. He unsaddled, moved through the motions, fed the stock, swept the barn, mended a gate that didn't need mending, but none of it filled the ache. By sundown, he was back on the porch, a mug of cold coffee in his hand. The house was too quiet, always had been since Ruth passed, and now it rang louder than before. She would have loved June. Ruth had always wanted a daughter. After the third failed pregnancy, they'd stopped speaking of children altogether, but not because the want disappeared. Just because grief taught them how to carry silence better than expectation. They buried the baby clothes in a cedar chest in the attic and left them there, untouched. He hadn't opened it since she died. John took one long sip, then stood. He couldn't shake it. That little girl's silence, her bones, her quiet obedience. It didn't sit right. He'd only been a guest for one night, but something had stirred, something old and aching. Something that said maybe this time he wasn't meant to walk away. He didn't sleep that night. By dawn, his mind was set. He arrived back at the Trask homestead 3 days later, dust on his coat, sweat in his collar, and purpose in his chest. He tied his horse by the gate this time. Didn't bother knocking. June was sweeping the porch when she saw him. The broom faltered in her grip, eyes wide, but she didn't speak, didn't run, just stood there. "Morning, June," he said, voice even. She blinked, nodded once. Her hands clenched tighter on the broomstick. Esther stepped onto the porch behind her, a dish towel in hand. "Well now, this is a surprise. I need to speak with your husband. He's out in the west pasture." "I'll wait." He dismounted, hitched the reins to the post, and took a seat on the porch steps. June disappeared inside without a word. Esther offered him coffee. He refused. Silence stretched between them like an old fence, tense, splintered, sagging under its own weight. It was almost an hour before Harold returned, dust on his boots, a fresh bruise on his knuckle. He squinted at John, confused. "Something wrong with your horse?" "No." "You forget something." "No." Harold stepped up to the porch, chewing his bottom lip. "Then what brings you back?" John stood, looked him square in the eyes. "I'd like to take June with me." Esther made a choking sound. Harold laughed. "Take her." "To the ranch, as ward or apprentice, whatever makes it legal." "She's our daughter," Harold said slowly, voice sharpening. John didn't flinch. "Then treat her like one." That landed hard. "She's cared for," Esther snapped. "She eats, she sleeps." "She serves," John interrupted. "She cleans, she fetches, she scrubs your boots and takes your beatings." Harold's jaw tensed. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling her a child." Silence. Then Esther scoffed. "You want to take in a girl now? At your age, you're alone, you've got no wife, no bloodline. What makes you think you're fit to raise someone else's daughter?" John didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned, stepped off the porch, and pointed toward his saddlebag. "Got a letter from the sheriff. He's aware of your parenting methods. Says I can file guardianship if I get her consent and the court agrees it's in her best interest." Harold barked a laugh. "Sheriff don't have say over what goes on in my house. He does when the town doctor's report matches what I saw. Bruised wrists, half-healed welts, malnourishment." That wiped the smile clean off. "I want to talk to her," John said. "Alone." Esther shook her head. "She's not some prize you get to take just because you decided to grow a conscience." "She's not a prize," John replied. "She's a little girl." Harold turned to shout into the house, "June, get out here." She came quickly, eyes wide again, broom long gone. Her hands twisted in front of her, fingers white at the knuckles. John stepped forward, crouched so they were level. "You remember what I asked you, about horses?" She nodded. "You still want to come see them?" A long pause. Then a whisper, "Yes." "Then come with me. I'll take care of you. I won't ask you to do more than you should, and I'll make sure no one ever raises a hand to you again." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She just nodded. Harold took a step forward, face red. "You ain't taking her." John stood, slowly, calmly, but with fire under his skin. "She's leaving with me. You want to stop that, you'll have to explain to the sheriff why she flinches every time you raise your voice. Why her back looks like it's been lashed." Esther looked away. Harold didn't move. John turned to June, offered a hand. She hesitated, then took it. They rode back under a wide, empty sky. June sat behind him on the saddle, arms looped tight around his waist, head pressed into his back. She didn't speak, but he felt her relax inch by inch, as the miles widened between her and the life she'd known. That night she sat at his kitchen table, a real plate in front of her, a fork, a cup of fresh milk. He didn't say much, just watched her eat. Not like a maid, not like a servant, but like a child. He didn't tuck her in. She chose the corner cot herself, wrapping the quilt tight and clutching the stuffed rabbit Ruth had once sewn and never used. When he checked in on her, her hand was curled beneath her chin, lips slightly parted in the softest kind of sleep. John stepped out onto the porch, breath deep, and looked to the stars. For the first time in years, he felt something shift in the bones of the house, not just because someone else lived there now, but because for once it felt full. He didn't need to be a father, but he could be. And sometimes that was enough. John didn't wake her at sunrise, let the girls sleep. He fed the horses, checked the fence lines, chopped wood for the stove, all before the sky shifted fully from indigo to gold. June didn't stir until the scent of frying eggs and coffee made its way under the quilt. She came quietly, barefoot, small, her eyes uncertain but clearer than before. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't call attention to her hair all mussed from sleep or the way she clutched the rabbit Ruth had sewn like a lifeline. Just placed a plate down across from him and said, "Eat while it's warm." She did, and that was enough. They fell into rhythm faster than he expected. June didn't speak much, but she watched everything. Watched how he moved around the barn, how he fed the chickens with one hand and opened the coop latch with the other. Watched how he cleaned tools after every use and tested the gates twice even when he was sure they were locked. She was learning the land through silence. He didn't try to fill it. And then came the questions. They started small. Do the chickens have names? Why do the horses chew the wood rails? Why do you wear gloves in summer? Her voice was still sandpaper thin, but it held something it hadn't before. Curiosity, not fear. He answered everyone, never once telling her to hush. Not even when she asked why the old photograph of a woman sat on the mantel, dusty, and leaned against a faded Bible. "That was Ruth," he said one afternoon, while they shelled peas on the porch. "She your wife?" He nodded. "She's in heaven." "I believe so." "She wanted a girl." He looked at her then. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Her knees swung gently back and forth beneath the chair. He nodded again, slower this time. "She would have braided my hair," June said, tugging at a loose strand near her ear. "I think she would have," John replied, and something in his chest gave way. Days passed. Then a week. The sheriff stopped by mid-month to check in, not because of any complaint but because he'd heard talk from Harold, loud, angry talk, and wanted to be sure things hadn't soured. He found John splitting firewood out back, sweat darkening the back of his shirt, and June curled up in the shade reading an old book about birds. "She all right?" the sheriff asked in a low voice as they stepped away. "She's safe," John replied. "Eating well, sleeping better, doesn't jump at every shadow anymore." The sheriff looked over his shoulder at the girl, who had paused to wave politely. Then he tipped his hat. "Seems good enough for me." The law didn't ask much when it came to orphans. Not in these parts. If you had a roof, food, a bed, and no history of violence, that was enough. Paperwork would follow, but the real test was the child's eyes, and June's no longer looked hollow. Later that evening, John found her in the hayloft, not hiding but sitting like she belonged there, legs dangling from the edge. "What are you thinking?" he asked as he climbed the ladder. June tilted her head. "Nothing." "That's a lie," he said gently. "Your face is all wrinkled up with thinking." She giggled. It was the first time he'd heard it. A real laugh, not polite, not scared, just bright. "I was thinking," she said, drawing her knees up, "that maybe I could stay forever." John didn't answer, just sat beside her, staring out at the lowering sun. After a long while he said, "I'd like that." But the world didn't leave people alone just because they'd found peace. Trouble had a way of finding doors. no matter how far they were from town. It started with a letter. Folded neat, no return address. Just Mr. John Fletcher in black ink. Inside, a summons. Harold and Esther Trask had filed a complaint through the regional court. Accusation of abduction. Demand for return of their daughter. John read the letter 3 times, jaw tight. Then he burned it. But he didn't ignore it. He rode into town the next day. June left with a trusted neighbor. He met with the town clerk, the sheriff, even Pastor Wesley. Everyone said the same thing. Legally, the Trasks had no leg to stand on. The girl had chosen to leave. There was a doctor's record, an affidavit from the sheriff. The judge would likely side with John. Likely. But if there was one thing John had learned in life, it was that likely didn't mean certain. And some men didn't fight clean. Harold Trask was a coward, but he was stubborn too, and stubborn cowards were dangerous when humiliated. So he started preparing. Not for a fight, but for a storm. He reinforced the back door, taught June how to hide in the root cellar if strangers ever came knocking when he was away. They practiced it like a game. She even packed a little box with her favorite book, a blanket, a jar of jam, just in case. "Is it gonna happen soon?" she asked one night. John didn't pretend. "Might." "You scared?" He looked at her small face, her strong little hands. "Only a failing you." The first knock came 3 days later. He was chopping onions when it landed, 3 firm raps on the front door. John wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, shotgun in plain view. Harold stood there, alone, no Esther, no lawman, just him and a smug grin. "You're not welcome," John said flatly. "Don't need to be," Harold replied. "She's mine, and I'm taking her home." John didn't step aside. "She left because you made her feel like nothing. She left because you filled her head with ideas. She left because you beat her." That took the grin off his face, for a moment. Then Harold pulled a folded document from his coat. "Court date S in 2 weeks. Better hope she says what you think she will. Otherwise." "Otherwise what?" John's voice dropped low. Harold looked past him, toward the window where a curtain shifted gently. "June." He smiled again. "Otherwise, I bring someone who does more than write letters." And then he left. That night, John pulled the cedar chest down from the attic. Ruth's old things. A baby blanket hand-stitched. A dress that never got worn. Letters she'd written him when they still believed they'd be parents. He showed June each item. "This was going to be for our daughter," he said softly. June ran her fingers across the faded fabric, her lip trembling. "She's got it now," John added. "You." And just like that, her arms were around his waist. Tight, fierce, small fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt like if she let go, everything would fall away. "You're my papa now," she whispered. His throat closed up. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He just held her. The storm was coming. But so was the fight. John had weathered loss before. He'd buried dreams, mourned what might have been. But this child, this tiny, quiet miracle who asked for nothing and gave back everything, she wasn't going to be another thing he lost to the world's cruelty. Not without a battle. And this time, he wouldn't be digging a grave. He'd be standing his ground. The days leading to the court hearing passed like a slow fuse burning its way toward powder. John had lived through storms, disease, drought, fire, but nothing had settled heavier in his chest than the idea of handing June back to people who used her like a servant and treated her like a burden. He'd faced death more than once. But this was different. This felt like standing between innocence and the noose. June didn't ask much about the hearing. She never once said Harold or Esther's name aloud, but she knew. Her eyes weren't as light as they'd been. Her steps were quiet again. She started packing her little bag each night and leaving it by the door, just in case. and that alone told John everything he needed to know about the damage done long before she ever stepped foot on his porch. He tried to talk with her one evening just after sunset, while they shelled corn by the fire. He didn't press, just asked gently if she was scared. June didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "If they make me go back, will you still think about me?" John's hand stopped moving. He set the cob down slowly, turned toward her, and reached over to brush a curl behind her ear. "I'd think about you every single day," he said, "and every night too." She didn't cry, but her lip trembled. Then she leaned into him, not saying another word, and stayed curled against his side until the fire burned low. They rode into town the morning of the hearing in John's wagon. June wore a blue dress Ruth had sewn long ago, one that had stayed folded for years until now. He'd had to let the hem out, add a sash to cinch the waist, but it fit. She looked small but strong. Her chin was lifted even though her hands trembled. People watched when they arrived. John could feel their stares from the boardwalks and saloons, whispers following them like smoke. Everyone in town knew the story by now, or thought they did. And like all gossip, truth had been bent until it barely resembled fact. But John didn't waste time correcting rumors. He kept his focus on the courthouse steps and the child beside him. Inside, the judge looked tired. He was a practical man, known to be fair but quick. Papers shuffled. The sheriff gave his testimony first, about the bruises, about June's condition, about how she hadn't cried when her parents didn't even notice she'd gone. Then came Harold. He stood proud, loud, painting himself and Esther as misunderstood. Said June had a wild streak, needed firm hands. Claimed John had poisoned her mind with soft words and false promises. It was all for show, of course. No sincerity, just theater. He even produced a preacher's note about children obeying their parents, but John could tell the judge wasn't moved. Finally, it was June's turn. She was called up gently. A clerk took her hand and led her to a chair that dwarfed her frame. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Her fingers clutched the skirt of her dress so tightly it looked like she'd ripped the fabric. "Miss June," the judge said kindly, "do you understand why you're here today?" She nodded. "And do you feel safe with Mr. Fletcher?" She nodded again. "He's my papa." "Did he ever ask you to call him that?" She shook her head. "No, I just did 'cause he is." "And do you want to go back with your birth parents?" Her voice caught. She looked straight at the judge and said, loud and clear, "They don't want me, not like he does." A hush fell across the courtroom. Even Harold's lawyer seemed unsure what to say next. The judge leaned back, took off his glasses and sighed. "Well," he said, tapping his gavel lightly, "this court believes children know where they're loved, and I don't see any cause to deny Miss June her right to stay where she's chosen." The ruling came down like a sunbeam through storm clouds. June didn't smile right away. She blinked, as if unsure what she'd heard. Then she ran straight into John's arms, and he knelt to meet her. It was over. They won. Back at the ranch, peace returned like rain on dry land. June's laughter came easier now, like water finally flowing after the thaw. She built little nests for the barn cats, sang to the chickens, and had started memorizing every plant around the house. Ruth's garden had never bloomed so bright. Sometimes John would catch her talking to the picture on the mantel, telling Ruth about her day, asking if she liked the dress, the pie, the scarf she'd sewed for Sunday. He never stopped her. One evening, while they walked the field to gather kindling, June paused and looked up at the sky. "You think she's happy I'm here?" she asked. John didn't need to ask who she meant. "I think Ruth waited a long time for you," he said. June reached up, slipped her hand into his. "I think I was waiting for you too." Trouble didn't come again for a while, but when it did, it didn't knock. It shattered glass. It was near midnight when the crash came, front window. June screamed. John was already out of bed, rifle in hand, boots flying. He reached the main room just in time to see the fire lick across the drapes. Someone had thrown a bottle of kerosene. He smothered the blaze fast, heart pounding, lungs burning, while June sobbed in the corner. Smoke curled up the walls. Outside, hoofbeats thundered away into the night. The sheriff came at dawn. No prints, no name, but John didn't need proof. He knew Harold's kind, the kind that couldn't stand to lose without making sure everyone paid for it. He boarded the window, reinforced the doors. June didn't ask questions, just stayed close for the next week, sleeping with Ruth's rabbit clutched tight. But it didn't break them. It didn't end them. They survived worse. Weeks turned into months. Spring bloomed, then summer. And one warm July afternoon, June did something that caught John off guard. They were in town for supplies. She saved a few coins from selling eggs and handmade trinkets. Outside the general store, she pointed at a shop window. "Can I get that?" she asked. It was a small frame, gold-leafed, meant for a photograph. John frowned. "We don't have a picture." June smiled. "We could take one." And so they did. A photographer set up out back. The sun was high, the dust kicked just right. June wore her best dress. John stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, her small hand tucked into his. Click. And the moment was frozen. A girl who once cowered under tables now stood tall beside the man who gave her back a future. Later that evening, June placed the photograph in the gold frame and set it beside Ruth's picture. Now there were two. She looked up at John as the sun slid low beyond the hills. "You know," she whispered, "I think this is what family means." John wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close. "It is now," he said. And the lamp inside flickered soft as dusk fell across the land. But the light inside that house, in that little girl, in that old widower's heart, never went out. By the time September rolled across the plains, the ranch was fully alive again. John found himself waking earlier, working longer, not because he had to, but because it felt worth it now. Every nail he hammered, every fence he fixed, every bucket of feed he carried, he did with a mind full of purpose. June had changed everything. And in the way only children can, she filled the silence Ruth had left behind, not by replacing her, but by gently reminding John that life hadn't stopped. It had only paused. The mornings had turned brisk, and golden light spilled across the land in soft waves. June had taken to waking with the sun, usually already dressed and halfway through feeding the chickens by the time John came down the steps. She'd sing to the coop like she was on stage, her little voice drifting through the air with something close to joy. But not all ghosts stay buried. One afternoon, while they were loading hay into the wagon, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. John noticed the glint of sunlight on a tin badge before anything else. Sheriff Elridge rode slow, hat low over his brow, posture stiff. When he dismounted, he didn't smile. "John," he said quietly, nodding. "Sheriff." The two men stepped aside, just out of earshot from where June was stacking bundles of dried herbs in the open wagon bed. "I didn't come to bring bad news," Elridge began, but his face said otherwise. "Just thought you ought to know Harold's dead." John didn't answer at first. He studied the sheriff's face, waiting for the part that mattered. "Drunk," Elridge said after a pause. "Took a swing at the wrong man in Carter's saloon. Fellow put him through a window, hit his head on the pump stone. Never got up." Still John said nothing. Elridge cleared his throat. "Esther left town the same night. No one's seen her since." John nodded once. "I reckon I won't lose sleep over either." "No, I don't suspect you will," the sheriff said, then tilted his head toward June. "But the girl should hear it better from you." He turned, mounted, and left without another word. That night, as the sky turned purple and wind rolled dry across the prairie grass, John sat beside June near the porch rail. She held her new sketchbook in her lap, drawing the outline of a hawk they'd seen earlier. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told her Harold had passed, that Esther had gone, that no one would be coming for her now, not ever again. She listened in silence, didn't cry, just stared off toward the horizon with her jaw tight, as if testing whether the news felt like freedom or like sorrow. "Is it bad I don't feel nothing?" she asked finally. "No," John said, placing his large hand over her small one. "That's not bad at all." She nodded, and they sat in peace until the stars blinked into view. With the past finally behind them, the future came faster than either expected. June started school in October. She didn't want to at first, terrified, really, but John talked her through it, promised she wouldn't be alone. On her first day, she wore a dress Ruth had once set aside for a daughter she never had. June's pigtails bounced as they walked into town together, her hand tucked into John's, her eyes darting around at the world waiting to meet her. It wasn't easy. The other children asked questions. Some were cruel. One girl snatched June's lunch and said, "My mama says you're the charity girl who lives with the grave digger." June didn't cry. She told the girl plainly, "My papa's a rancher. He don't dig graves. He plants hope." John had never been prouder. He heard the story later from Miss Leavitt, the school teacher, who smiled as she told it, and added that June had learned her letters faster than anyone in the class. "She's a fighter," the teacher said. "Whatever she's been through, it didn't break her." "No," John agreed, "it made her." Winter came harder than expected. Ice clawed at the windows and snow drifted higher than the porch rails. But inside the ranch house, the fire burned warm and laughter came easy. June made a snow angel so wide it took up half the back field. She carved tiny figurines for each of the barn cats and lined them on the windowsill. Every night, she asked John to read aloud from Ruth's Bible, pointing at the verses with wonder, asking questions so big they sometimes took John hours to answer. One night after she drifted to sleep, he sat by the hearth, staring at the embers, wondering how life had turned so sharply from ending to beginning. He still felt the ache in his chest, the sickness he'd tried to ignore for months. The days when pain gripped his bones harder than the frost ever could. But now he had reason to keep fighting. A second opinion had come weeks earlier in a sealed envelope from the Capitol. The doctor's words were measured, hopeful. The cancer was slow growing, not yet spread. With rest, diet, and proper care, John could have years, maybe more. He hadn't told June yet. He wanted to be sure. But something deep in him, something bigger than fear or doubt, whispered that he wouldn't be leaving her anytime soon. Spring returned like a hymn long forgotten. The ranch bloomed, trees filled with birds, fields greened, and June grew. She ran faster now, spoke bolder, asked questions no one could answer. She wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. She wasn't afraid of anything. On her 9th birthday, John gave her a locket with Ruth's initials on one side and June's on the other. "It's yours now," he said. "Both names, both legacies." June held it tight to her chest, tears in her eyes. Then she asked softly, "Can we add yours too?" John smiled. "I reckon we already have." One night in June, after dinner, while fireflies blinked in the tall grass and the wind smelled of honey and lilac, June leaned against the fence post and watched the sun set. John joined her, tired but content. "You ever think," she said, "how things could have gone different? Like if you hadn't stopped that day, if you hadn't said anything at the table?" "I think about it every day," he admitted. "I think I'd still be sweeping floors and praying someone noticed." "I think I'd still be digging," John said, his voice quiet. June looked up at him, eyes deep and wide with knowing. "I think God saw both of us," she whispered, "even when we didn't see ourselves." John turned toward her, the last sliver of sun catching her cheek, and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I think he did." And in that moment, with the fields glowing gold and the world holding still just long enough, they both knew. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The days that followed were drenched in peace. The kind that's not loud or flashy, but quiet and steady, like the drip of morning dew off fence wire or the stretch of a cat warming itself beneath a sunlit window. June moved through the house like she belonged, and not in the way some guests grow used to a place, but in the way a child reclaims a space as her own. She hung up drawings on the kitchen wall, some with misshapen horses, others with crooked trees, and one that John noticed showed a man holding the hand of a little girl. There were no faces, just outlines, but John didn't need details. He saw it for what it was. He kept it tucked in the edge of the mirror over the fireplace. By late spring, John began preparing the east field for summer planting. June begged to help, and though the work was hard and her legs were still small, she never complained. She carried buckets. She scattered seeds. She sang while she worked, some made-up melody that kept pace with the wind. They took lunch in the shade of the sycamore Ruth had planted years ago, and as John leaned back against the trunk, June curled beside him, dozing against his shoulder. The warmth of her trust did something to him. Not the same as the ache of loss, not quite the sharp pinch of memory either. It was softer, like something broken healing without asking permission. She was changing him, and he knew it. But one morning, a letter arrived. It came in a thin, creased envelope, no return address. The postmark was from 2 towns over. John didn't open it right away. He left it sitting on the mantel while he fixed the barn door and fed the horses. But by sunset, curiosity and that old gnawing sense of dread got the better of him. He opened it slowly, carefully, like it might hold something poisonous. Inside was a note, handwritten in sharp, angular script. "She has family, real blood, we're coming for her." There was no name, just that. John sat still for a long time. The fire cracked quietly behind him. Outside he could hear June laughing with the chickens. Innocent, happy. He didn't know who had written it, didn't know if it was a bluff or a threat, but he knew enough about people, especially the kind who talk of blood rights, to take it seriously. He didn't tell her, not that day, not yet. Instead, he did what he always did when the world shook. He made a plan. That night he packed a small canvas bag with essentials, not to run but to be ready. He oiled the rifle, locked the doors, and checked the lanterns twice before bed. He watched her sleep, her little frame rising and falling beneath the quilt. She looked so small but stronger than any grown man he'd known. He wouldn't let anyone take her. He couldn't. 3 days passed. Nothing came. No riders, no second letters. John began to hope it had been a prank, or maybe a cruel cousin from her past trying to scare them. Still, he stayed alert. The unease didn't fade. Then on the 4th day, they came. It was a Sunday. They'd just come back from town. June had found a dress at the general store's discount bin, sunflower yellow, a little big, but she twirled in it like it was made of silk. John spotted the riders as they turned the bend past the creek. 3 men, all in black coats despite the heat. One older with silver hair slicked back beneath a bowler. 2 younger built like hired guns, too polished to be ranchers. John sent June inside without a word. Just a look, she obeyed. The lead man tipped his hat as he approached. Afternoon. John stood on the porch, arms crossed. Can't say it is. The man chuckled. Now don't be that way, we've come for the girl. No harm meant, just righting a wrong. She's not a package to be delivered. She's blood, my niece, my brother's daughter, that means something. John's voice was iron. Where were you when she was cleaning floors and sleeping on the cellar cot? The man smirked. Not my fault Harold didn't raise his family right. No, John said, but it'll be your fault if you try to take her now. The man's smile faltered. You think you got a say? I've earned one. The man took a step forward, so did John. A long silence hung between them, hot and stiff as a drumhead. Then the man shook his head, disappointed. You always were stubborn, John. even back when we rode fence lines together." John narrowed his eyes. "Didn't think you'd remember me." Hard to forget a man who ran off to marry a barren woman and bury himself on a hill. John's fists clenched. He didn't strike, not yet. "You want the girl," he said, voice low. "You'll have to go through me." The men exchanged glances. The younger two shifted in their saddles, eyes flicking toward the house. Inside, June stood at the window, clutching the wooden carving John had made her. A hawk, wings outstretched. Her small hands trembled, but her chin stayed up. She wasn't running, not anymore. Things escalated quickly. The next morning the sheriff rode out. John had sent for him during the night. Sheriff Elridge brought papers, official guardianship approval from the judge in town. The document didn't carry blood, but it carried proof. The three men didn't like it. They argued, threatened, but they didn't draw. In the end, it was June who stepped out on the porch, hair wild in the wind, and said calmly, "I'm not going anywhere with you." The older man looked stunned. "You don't even know me." "I know you weren't there," she said, eyes hard. "You left me with them, but he didn't." She pointed to John. Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "He loves me, that's what counts." The sheriff stepped between them before things turned violent. Eventually, the men left. They didn't apologize, didn't promise they'd stay gone, but they left. John watched them disappear into the trees, heart pounding. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for now they'd won. And sometimes, for now was enough. That night June asked him something. "Do you ever think about Ruth?" He nodded. "Every day." "Do you think she would have liked me?" John smiled. "Sweetheart, she would have loved you the moment you opened your mouth." June laughed. Then she said very softly, "I think about her too, even if I didn't meet her. She feels here like part of the house." "She is," he whispered. They sat in silence. The stars blinked above, quiet and knowing. June leaned her head against his arm. "I don't need their blood," she said. "No," John agreed, kissing the top of her head. "You've got heart, and that's stronger." Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the night, a hawk cried out. The ranch didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt alive. The ranch changed with the season. As spring spilled into summer, wildflowers crept back along the fence posts and the creeks ran fuller and brighter than they had in years. The trees thickened, green and tall, casting shadows over the trail where John used to walk alone. But now there were two sets of footsteps in the dust, one slow and heavy, the other lighter, faster, always skipping ahead and then circling back. June never wandered far from John. She still slept in the room that had once been Ruth's sewing room, though now it was covered in colors. Blankets she'd made from scraps, books from the town library, dolls and little wooden animals John carved when the nights ran long. She kept that hawk carving on her shelf, right next to a framed drawing she made of John holding her hand beside a big house with a red roof and a sign that said home. There was peace in the everyday now. She helped with the chores, swept the floors without being asked, brushed the horses, and tended the chickens with the focus of someone twice her age. John sometimes caught her humming to the goats, soft little tunes he didn't recognize. When he asked, she shrugged and said, "I think they like it." John rarely smiled big, but June pulled more than a few out of him without trying. She talked a lot now, asked questions about the land, about Ruth, about what it meant to be a rancher. And John answered, patiently, always honestly. Some answers hurt, like when she asked if he had any other children. He didn't dodge it, he just said, "We tried, the Lord had different plans." She nodded slowly, understanding more than she should for her age. And then she asked, "Did you ever think maybe your plan was me?" He couldn't speak after that, just pulled her into his arms and held her until the words weren't needed. But under all the warmth, all the healing, one truth loomed quiet and cruel. John was dying. He didn't speak of it much, and when he did, it was with the calm of a man who'd already made peace. The coughs had returned, soft at first then sharper. He hid the blood-stained rags, but June wasn't blind. She knew. She watched the way he paused when he stood too fast, the way he'd press a hand to his ribs when he thought she wasn't looking. And so the days grew gentler, slower, not in sadness but in intention. They planted vegetables together, though John mostly watched while June dug and watered. They visited town less, preferring to stay on the land where everything felt familiar and whole. One day in July, John sat her down beneath the sycamore and handed her a sealed envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "It's something you'll need later for the sheriff. Inside a letter, my will, some papers for the ranch." Her face went still. "You're giving me the ranch?" He nodded. "Everything on it. You're my daughter, June. Doesn't matter what blood says." She looked down at the envelope, then back at him. "But what if I mess it up?" "You won't." "How do you know?" He took her hand, rough and calloused, in hers. "Because you've already saved it." She hugged him then, hard enough he winced, but he didn't stop her. They stayed like that for a long time. The last ride they ever took together was at dusk. The sun had gone red and wide, stretching across the sky like fire caught in slow motion. John rode slow, with June in front of him, her head resting back against his chest. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He brought her to a hill just above the north pasture. It overlooked the creek, the barn, the distant bend where Ruth had first said she wanted to build a swing one day. It was quiet up there, but alive. Breezes carrying stories. Birds flitting through the sky like they had some place to be. He pointed to a small fence post half buried in grass. "That's where Ruth is," he said. June nodded. "Will you be beside her?" John smiled faintly. "If the Lord's willing." He didn't ride again after that day. The next week, the pain grew too strong. June stayed by his side. She read aloud to him, stories he'd already heard but wanted to hear in her voice. She brought water and cooled his forehead with a cloth when the fevers came. When he couldn't speak, she held his hand and whispered the things she wished for. "One day I'll teach a little girl how to ride. Maybe I'll build a library in the barn. I'm going to fix that loose step you always trip on. Will you watch from heaven?" His hand tightened around hers in answer. On a morning too quiet to be ordinary, June walked to the porch and sat with the folded blanket he'd used the night before. She didn't cry, not yet. She just sat, listening to the wind shift through the grass the way John had taught her. She knew he was gone, not because she'd seen it, but because the house felt still. Not empty, not lonely, just stilled like a candle just blown out. The sheriff came at noon. June handed him the envelope. He read it slowly, then looked at her with an expression that held more respect than pity. "Anything you need, you let me know." She nodded. "I mean it." "I know," she said. By sunset, neighbors trickled in. Miss Penny from town brought a pot pie. The Harkers came with tools, saying they'd help keep up the fencing. No one talked too loud. No one pried. They all knew what kind of man John Harlan had been. And they saw in June what he'd left behind. Weeks passed, then months. June ran the ranch. Not alone, not yet, but she was at the center of it. She fed the animals. She led the harvest. She sat on the porch at dusk with the same quiet strength John had once worn like a second skin. She was different now. Not harder, but older in the eyes. She didn't laugh quite as much, but when she did, it was real, deep. She wrote a letter to Ruth, tied it to the hawk carving, and placed it beneath the sycamore. "Thank you for loving him first. I'll love him always." And then, one evening, as stars spilled across the sky, she stood at the edge of the porch and whispered into the wind, "I'm okay, Papa." And somewhere beyond breath, beyond pain, beyond all the things time forgets, a man who once dug his own grave smiled softly and said, "I know." And 3 years later, the wind hadn't changed much. It still whispered through the fence rails in the same hush John Harlan used to hum when brushing the horses. The ranch looked mostly the same: weathered wood, patched roofs, tools leaned exactly where they should be, but the hands running it had changed. June was taller now, 12, though she moved like someone older. The awkwardness of girlhood was still there in her two big boots, and the way she chewed her lip when the books didn't balance at the end of the week. But there was a calm about her, a steadiness that came from long days, hard work, and a grief that had shaped her without breaking her. She kept a journal now. John's handwriting lessons had stuck. Every evening she wrote a few lines by lantern light, sitting at the same kitchen table where he once sat carving wooden birds. The hawk still perched on the shelf. She never moved it. Today the journal entry read, "Fence held through the storm, chestnuts expecting, mended the east trough, rode to town. Saw Ruth's sister, she asked how I was holding up. I told her I'm still here." That seemed to be enough. A knock came mid-morning, rare out here. June wiped her hands and opened the door. A boy stood there, maybe 9, shoes too thin for the road. Behind him, a girl younger still, clinging to his arm like a branch in wind. They were dusty, hungry, familiar. June didn't ask where they came from. She didn't ask why. She just stepped aside and said softly, "Come in." The boy hesitated. The girl didn't. June made biscuits that afternoon. Not as good as John's, but close. The boy didn't speak much. She let that be. The girl asked if there were animals, and June showed her to the chicken coop, told her the names of the hens. The girl lit up. When the sun dipped low, June brought out quilts and laid them by the hearth. She stoked the fire just as John had taught her, slow and steady, never too fast. As the embers caught and the cabin warmed, the boy finally looked up. "You live here alone?" June paused. Not alone, just without him now. The boy didn't ask who. Maybe he already understood. That night June sat on the porch. The stars blinked overhead, sharp and clear. She held her journal in one hand, the pen in the other, but didn't write yet. Instead, she whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer but giving the words away anyway. "They needed somewhere. I think this is what you meant, isn't it? That family isn't what you start with, it's what you build." A breeze stirred the grass, and she smiled faintly. Inside, the children slept soundly. Outside, the land kept breathing. And above it all, one star, just one, seemed to burn a little brighter.